Well, good evening. I'm Kirk Freudenberg, Chair of the Department of Classics here at Yale University, and it's my honor and delight to welcome all of you to the second annual Anne Amory and Adam Parry Lecture. I won't be introducing tonight's speaker. That will be David Quint's task. But the lecture series, I will introduce the lecture series to which he will contribute, which was the result several years back of one of our graduate students, Chris Simon, soon to finish and depart for Berlin, thinking out loud about how nice it would be to have a splashy, distinguished lecture series in the spring semester, something to bring Yale's comp lit crowd into conversation with its classics crowd in ways that Anne Amory and Adam Parry would have appreciated, and as something of a modern counterbalance to our ancient history lecture, the Rostovtsev lecture, in the fall. And thus, with Chris Kraus serving as producer, director, and midwife to this excellent idea, the series was born. Started just last year, the series aims to highlight the work of scholars of ancient literature who excel in the methods and talents that were once so beautifully exemplified by the Parrys, the thoughtful and detailed analysis of Greek and Latin texts, as well as the further receptions of those texts in ways that are at once adventurous, elegantly written, and critically informed. The Bingham Library is the right place for this lecture. It houses the books that once belonged to Anne Amory and Adam Parry, as well as the PhD dissertations of just some of the many students whom the dynamic husband and wife pair would have worked with in the late 60s and early 70s before meeting their tragic simultaneous end in a motorcycle accident in 1971. Both Anne and Adam were leading scholars of Homer and Homeric criticism, as well as the study of other ancient texts, especially Thucydides and Virgil. It is in the spirit of their wide-ranging, elegantly written, and exciting scholarship that we invited Joseph Russo, a former colleague and protege of both Anne Amory and Adam Parry, to give last year's inaugural lecture, and it is with equal commitment to that spirit and enthusiasm for the scholar whom we've chosen that we proudly present tonight's speaker. And for that, I now turn the microphone over to David Quint, who will introduce Dr. Gordon Braden.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Gordon Braden, who is an old friend. He is the Linden Kent Memorial Professor of English at the University of Virginia. He is also the most distinguished scholar of Renaissance literature in this country. He is, I say that with no false modesty on anybody's part. He is, in fact, the most distinguished scholar of Renaissance literature in this country, whose 4 books are sort of monuments to the kind of work that only someone who is totally versed in the classics has an elegant and witty style, and who is also a really deep thinker could produce. I'm just going to say something very briefly about these books. To try to keep this short so that Gordon will have time. The Classics and English Renaissance Poetry, 3 case studies, contains as its largest case study a classic essay on Hero and Leander and its various adaptations in Renaissance literature up to Marlowe, who is Marlowe's great poem, bringing to light for most people who read Marlowe's poem suddenly the recognition that this poem had gone through many different versions in European literature before it came to England. It also exemplifies one aspect of Gordon's work, which is his insistence on the late classical, something which is going to come, I think, we're going to see in today's lecture, that the importance for the Renaissance of not only of Musaeus, but also of Nonnos. He's a great champion of Nonnos, and also of Claudian. And his point is that here are these late classical writers who had digested themselves and had to deal with the great works of classical Greece and of Golden Age Rome, and who had to themselves confront the problem of being latecomers in the tradition, and therefore for the Renaissance, these are the writers whom Renaissance writers turn to in order to themselves, as latecomers, try to work with the classical tradition. Renaissance tragedy and the Senecan tradition, Anger's Privilege, is the most important book on Renaissance tragedy of our particular academic generation. It is a book which carefully traces the importance, taking its cue from T.S. Eliot, it carefully traces what is Senecan in tragedy and the way in which there is a kind of diversification of tragedy into the English tradition of Marlowe and Shakespeare, and then into the French tradition of Corneille. It is really indispensable for anyone who wants to work on tragedy. The idea of the Renaissance, which he wrote with William Kerrigan, is the most important single synthetic book about the Renaissance that has been produced, again, in our academic generation. Something which both is able to describe with kind of new kinds of syntheses what really was most important about this period, and also which delves into detailed readings of individual texts and then moves gracefully back to the larger general issues. It is, as students in my Renaissance core course know, it's the first thing that they read, and particularly its wonderful chapter on Burckhardt. Petrarch in Love and the Continental Renaissance marks Gordon's movement really towards the study of lyric poetry, which has really been what he's been concentrating on in many ways for the last decade. It is the most important single statement about Petrarch that has been written in the last 25 years. Not the least of its accomplishments is to inform us that Laura may very well have been completely unaware of Petrarch's presence. There is nothing in the sequence which actually indicates that she knows who he is. all of which is an indication, one more, that she is simply a phantasm, phantasmatic projection on the part of the lyric poet. This has just not been noticed before by anybody who read through those 365 poems, that in fact she has no idea who he is. This book, however, is much larger than that. It also offers a really strong interpretation of Petrarchism, which runs through the entire European Renaissance and into the New World, because this last chapter is a wonderful chapter on Sor Juana de la Cruz in Mexico. He's also, when he was writing this book, he also wrote what were really fundamental essays on women lyric poets of the Renaissance, Gaspar Stampa, and also Lucrezia Borgia, who you may not have known, was a woman poet and who corresponded with the great lyric poet Pietro Bembo. These are foundational essays for people who want to work in the field. So I'm giving you an idea of just how much and how foundational Gordon's work has been. Let me also just say that in addition to this extraordinary scholarly output, which also includes the 16th century, the Anthology of 16th century English lyric poetry, which all students in my lyric poetry course know because that's what they have used. Gordon was also chair for 6 years at the English department at the University of Virginia. And those of you, many people in the room know, this is perhaps the strongest English department in the country. And we here at Yale like to think that we're also very strong, but it is one of the strongest departments in the country, and it is partly it's partly due to the work of Gordon Braden in building and maintaining that department. So this is somebody who has not not only been a great scholar, but also paid his dues in building the university around him. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Gordon and his usual wittily titled lecture, Epic Annoyance, from Homer to Palladas. Gordon.
Thank you. I won't pretend I didn't enjoy that. I should probably die right now, though that's not my plan. But thank you very much for that. Thank you. There's a handout here which is sort of it's just the Greek text of the poem, the Greek poems I'm going to be talking about. There are about 24 of them, and I thought, since there are some people in the room who do know Greek that would appreciate having those texts, and also occasionally particular words are at issue, and there's some wordplay and some punning that can be visible even if you don't, even if all you can read is the alphabet. Anyway, I will signal those poems when we come to them, but they're numbered here, 1 through 23, I believe. No other poet has had so many poems ascribed to him in the Greek Anthology as Palladas of Alexandria. 155, give or take. Give or take because some poems are ascribed to him in the Palatine Anthology, but not in the Plenutian, and vice versa, and because later scholars have, with various kinds of arguments, both disallowed some attributions and added new ones. A few other poems have turned up in other sources. Most of these poems are grouped in books 9, 10, and 11 of the Palatine Anthology, groupings characterized in the manuscript as epideictica, protreptica, and sympotica kai skoptica. There are, however, enough outliers to secure Palladas' appearance in each of the 5 volumes of W.R. Patton's Loeb edition. The anthology's way of dispersing poems by category this way generally obscures the profiles of individual authors, but the heft of Palladas' contribution makes his stand out. It's been theorized that a collected edition of his poems existed and circulated in antiquity, almost certainly including more poems than the ones we have. And as luck would have it, and in case you're interested, I had no notion of this before I picked my topic and started researching this talk, work by Kevin Wilkinson, one of Yale Classics' recent PhDs, has suggested that what had previously been just a box of papyrus scraps over at the Beinecke is in fact the badly tattered but not indecipherable remains of such a collection. That work is, among other things, the basis for one of the newest proposals for an addition to Palladas' oeuvre, and along with some other conclusions of Wilkinson's scholarship, I'll be touching on that before I'm through today. But it isn't just numbers that lead one into talking of Palladas' oeuvre. It's long been sensed that there is something about his poems that come down to us under his name, or enough of them at least, that stands out in an individuated way within the generically scripted corpus of ancient epigram, and prompts us to speak in relatively modern terms of a special authorial voice or vision or at least signature. It was in response to the sense of hearing such a voice that the English poet Tony Harrison was moved to translate 71 of the poems, a shade less than half the total, in a standalone edition of 1975, possibly the closest thing to a collected Palladas since the Yale Epigram Codex went through the shredder. A brief preface of appreciation by Harrison is still one of the most interesting critical essays on the poet. Palladas snagged my own attention some decades back on my first trip through the anthology, and over the years I've spent some time trying to decide just what that hook was. The invitation for this lecture seemed like a good occasion for assembling some of my thinking. Central to his claim to literary distinction is, by any account, his talent for abuse. The classical category here is epigramma skoptikon, the epigram of mockery, officially assigned to share Book 11 with epigramma sympotikon, the epigram of festivity. Epigrams, it would seem, as party entertainment. The Palatine editor's understanding of genre doesn't seem especially rigorous or sophisticated, and more than twice as many of Palladas' poems, including some of what now seem his most characteristic, are in other books under other generic labels. In any case, his practice has impressed later readers as something exceeding the scoptic category, the expectations for which we take to be on view back in the 1st century in Lucilius, who's also in the Anthology, sometimes right next to Palladas, and especially Martial. Harrison writes of, quote, the apoplectic energy of his nihilistic scorn, unquote. Gilbert Hyatt puts him in the company of, quote, the world's great pessimists, unquote, with Juvenal, Swift, Nietzsche, and the author of Ecclesiastes. There's one poem in particular, 1045, that inspires such claims, and I quote here Harrison's version. This is number 1. Think of your conception. You'll soon forget what Plato puffs you up with, all that immortality and divine life stuff. Man, why dost thou think of heaven? Nay, consider thine origins in common clay is one way of putting it, but not blunt enough. Think of your father, sweating, drooling, drunk. You, his spark of lust, his spurt of spunk. The Palatine anthologist classifies this with the epigrammata protreptica, epigrams of exhortation. In this case, an exhortation to avoid megalophrosune, overreaching thoughts. But the antidote to excessive pride is not exactly sophrosune. Such a wise exhortation is voiced, and Harrison there makes it sound biblical to enhance the effect. Instead of, man, why dost thou think of heaven? Nay, consider thine origins in common clay. So Harrison makes it sound biblical to enhance the effect, but then scorned. It has just been a setup for the nasty punchline. The recommendation is not for graceful humility, but for self-disgust over something the addressee can do nothing to change. That addressee in Greek is simply anthropos, which we might translate in a generalizable sense as mankind, though the punchline makes it sound pointedly gendered. The object of disgust is not just the physicality of our engendering, but specifically paternal ejaculation. Though the sweat, the drool, and the blood alcohol level are in the Swiftian spirit of things and entirely plausible, but those are Harrison's contribution. The targeting of Plato is precise. The Greek phrase Harrison translates as divine life is phyton uranion, heavenly plant, a direct quotation from the Timaeus, and from a passage in which the speaker is exhorting his interlocutor always to remember that our roots are in heaven. For Palladas, that is just a lie. Our roots are the fury and the mire of human veins. Palladas is seldom so philosophical. He does tell us in one poem that all the world's a stage, skene pos hobios kai pagnion, that's number 2. But he only has 2 lines on the subject and is comparatively lighthearted in his advice. Either get with the program and don't be so serious, or just suffer through it. That doesn't show much of Palladas' trademark aggression, which in 1045 is directed against anthropos at large, though it usually has a better defined, even petty target. I put it that way because I've come to think that the manifest pettiness of many of his poems is essential to the aesthetic of the scoptic epigram. Scoptica is often translated, as in Patton's Loeb, as satirical, but that seems to me to overshoot the mark. Hyatt, even as he praises Palladas in the company of Juvenal as a great pessimist, is careful not to use the term satirist. His reasoning is on view when he says that Juvenal, quote, unlike other pessimists of antiquity, such as Palladas, blended his pessimism with a strong sense of moral purpose, unquote. Such purpose is implicit in the term satire. This mockery, however entertaining, is being carried on in the name of some intelligible scheme of values, but Palladas is, well, doing something different. Georg Luke is willing to call him a satirist, but only with some things clearly understood. Quote, if it is true that every satirist is a frustrated moralist, Palladas must be the exception to the rule. His eloquence is the eloquence of the manager of a freak show. He does not have to appeal to moral standards in order to attract his public, unquote. Such eloquence does have its pedigree. It is established as a part of the Greek literary repertoire a millennium earlier by the Ephesian poet Hipponax. Hipponax's legacy, as I understand it, is of indelible, if often cryptic, hostility to human beings of his acquaintance. And, quote, one of my favorite poems in the world, actually, number 3, And I hope it could stand alone as a poem, and I'm happy to let it do so. Somebody hold my coat. I'm going to hit Bupalus in the eye. Hipponax's is, I believe, the earliest documented use of the term motherfucker. Metrokoites, that motherfucker Bupalus, that's quotation number 4. Metrokoites hapax legomenon, I believe. Hipponax may have made the word up, though there's no mistaking what it means. There's little, if any, pretense to nobility of purpose in the fragments that have survived of Hipponax, as David Campbell puts it in something of an understatement, quote, he seems deliberately to have lowered the tone of poetry, unquote. Mary Renault imagines him memorably in The Praise Singer, 1978, her novel about Simonides of Chios and Greece's lyric age. And this is Simonides himself describing a dinner that he had with Hipponax in Ephesus. That his clothes were dirty I put down to his having no wife, but I thought that in a city not short of water he could have washed himself. He ate noisily. Poor old Metrike, who had been cooking half the day to honor a guest, was not out of hearing before he mocked at her fat buttocks. This started him on women, his favorite theme. Not that one had to offend him for him to cut one up. He only needed to hear anyone praised. Before supper was over, he had accused the city's best sculptor of stealing bronze, the least greedy of the nobles of being too cowardly to risk a quarrel, and a gentle old priest gifted with prophecy of vices I'd never heard of till that night. Such was my first meeting with Hipponax. It had done me good. It showed me that the face of envy is uglier than a birthmark on the cheek, unquote. A couple of centuries later, the Alexandrians fell in love with him and preserved his poems in a collection of 2 or possibly 3 books. The presumption of such poetry, and I take it to be the enabling presumption of Scoptic epigram generally, is that ill nature needs no justification except perhaps the wittiness of its expression. Or, to put it another way, its justification is an underlying irritability that is one of the constants of human nature, a basic annoyance at the mere existence of other people, a gut reaction to the experience of having to share the planet with so many of them. That irritability is, of course, stronger in some people than in others, and in everyone it has to share psychic space with very different emotions, and also with whatever moral and practical intelligence we can muster to remind ourselves that, well, sharing does mean sharing. Still, there it is, so commonplace and familiar an emotion that we don't exactly have a name for it. The closest we come, maybe, is when poets write about it. Here's W.H. Auden. Some 30 inches from my nose, the frontier of my person goes, and all the untilled air between is private pagus, or demesne. Stranger, unless with bedroom eyes I beckon you to fraternize, beware of rudely crossing it. I have no gun, but I can spit. Or here, even more economically, is Marshall 132 in the most succinct theorizing of the Scoptic epigram I know of, quote, famous one, many of you probably know this, non amote sabidi, nec possum dicere quaere hoc tantum possum dicere non amote. I do not love you, Sabidius, and I cannot tell you why. This much I can say, I do not love you. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell, the reason why I cannot tell, but this I know and know full well. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. I'm put in mind of the line from Beth Henley's Crimes of the Heart, in which a character is asked what she's going to tell her lawyer about why she shot her husband. Quote, I didn't like his looks. I didn't like his stinking looks, unquote. There does, to be sure, turn out to be more to it than that, but experience tells us that there doesn't need to be. People do indeed shoot other people with about that level of motivation. To return to Palladas, there are a couple of places where he writes of his own craft of ad hominem verbal abuse, psogos is the word in Greek, as an almost rapturous end in itself. Dudley Fitz catches that note well in his translation of 11:341. This is number 5. Praise, of course, is best. Plain speech breeds hate. But the Attic honey of telling a man exactly what you think of him. The only fault I would find with that translation is at the very end. Exactly what you think of him does at least suggest some reasoned process of judgment behind the abuse. The Greek suggests no such thing. It's just kakos epein, to talk badly, trash talk, pure and simple. This two-liner distills the autobiographical vignette in the previous epigram, 11,340, and this is number 6. I swore 10,000 times to make no more epigrams, for I have drawn upon myself the hatred of many morons. But when I see the face of Pantagathos of Paphlagonia, I cannot hold back my disease. The guy's outrageous name, I mean Pantagathos for Pete's sake, Mr. Goody Two-Shoes, may conceivably been what set our poet off, though Palladas' habit elsewhere of making fun of people's noses, 11,204, 11,255, leads me to put the emphasis on prosopon, face. I didn't like his looks. I didn't like his stinking looks. Someone in antiquity wrote a poem by Palladas on the wall of latrine in Ephesus, Hipponax's city, an uncanny act of literary homage worth citing, even though its survival and meaning are both probably tricks of history. The poem itself, 1087, is about what a whore Lady Luck is, tuche porne. A sturdier affiliation from Palladas back to Hipponax is documented in what Renault Simonides reports was Hipponax's favorite theme and was certainly near the top of Palladas's list. Stobaeus preserves a choliambic couplet which he attributes to Hipponax, an attribution that has been challenged but still stands. It sounds like a complete poem, and this is Hipponax now. And the choliambs is Hipponax's signature meter, which is a iambic line with a jerk there at the end, da-dup, 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 dup-dup. But that can at the end of each line. It's associated with him. And this is a choliambic poem. 2 days of a woman are sweetest, when you marry her, and when you carry her out dead. That's number 7. An iambic one-liner with a simplified version of a sententia, one-liner with a simplified version of the sententia is attributed to Menander. It's better to bury a woman than to marry one, number 8. That suggests that the witticism, if that is the word for it, becomes commonplace. But Palladas seems to have the choliambic original specifically in his sights when he crafts one of his elegiac couplets. And this should be number 9. Yeah, there it is. Every woman is a source of anger. She has 2 good hours, one in bed, and the other in death. That translation doesn't give any idea why the rewrite seemed worth the effort, but in the Greek it jumps out at you. In the pentameter, Palladas has rendered the opposite gender's 2 good moments as a balancing of 2 words that differ only in 2 letters, entalamoi and tanatoi, talamos, thanatos. Death and the marriage chamber knit together so intricately that the epigram seems to be fated, which of course was the idea. Hipponax is just surly in comparison. Palladas is conspicuously clever, flaunting the verbal adroitness that marks his work elsewhere. Another poem of his turns on the fact that the Greek words for crow and for flatterer differ in exactly 1 letter, korax, kolax. And when the poem appears in print 1,000 years later in editions of the Planudian Anthology, it seems above all its lexical dexterity that makes it one of the more translated poems in the classical canon. Peter Jay, in his 1973 Penguin Anthology of English translations from the anthology, including quite a few of Harrison's, was sufficiently struck by this phenomenon to devote an appendix to multiple 20th century versions of this one epigram, 7 in addition to the one, 7 altogether, 7 in addition to the one by Harrison in Jay's main text. That appendix caught my attention at the time, and without making any particular attempt to be thorough, I have over the years garnered 4 more translations of that couplet from the 16th and 17th centuries. The far more systematic researches of James Hutton into the diffusion of the anthology up to 1800 have cataloged the standout popularity of this one poem with translators into Italian, French, and especially Latin. A final count would be in the dozens. The challenge to translators is, of course, to find in the target language some equivalent to the providential thalamos thanatos pairing in the Greek. The relative lack of success is itself probably one reason they have kept trying. It's somewhat easier in Latin, partly because you can cheat a bit. Jean Doat, one of the French Pléiades, comes perhaps closest with in thalamo, in tumulo. In English, to my surprise, no one I've found thinks of Mary and Barry, though I realize that's not a rhyme in all Anglophone pronunciations. There's fondness for the more abrupt bed and dead, though the loss of the polysyllabic flourish of the original is certainly felt. Some translators take a step back so as not to stake it all on two words. Robin Skelton, in the 20th century, defines the two happy days as, quote, one when she gives up her virtue and one when she gives up the ghost. Though here the wit changes the message, since gives up her virtue doesn't really apply to the marriage night, or wedding night. Timothy Kendall in the 16th century foregoes wordplay altogether in favor of coming right out and saying what apparently nobody else wants to say. Although all womenkind be not, yet 2 good days hath she, her marriage day and day of death, when all she leaves to thee. The most considerable poet to tackle the poem, Ezra Pound, bends the sense of what we're talking about here in, I think, yet another direction, and in the process finds a way to a surprisingly hearty conclusion. Woman? Oh, woman is a consummate rage, but dead or asleep, she pleases. Take her. She has 2 excellent seasons. Take her has a backspin on it, to be sure, but it introduces an affirmative note beyond anything in Palladas. But the real surprise is that Pound seems to have taken sex out of it. The twin to death is sleep, not marriage. I suppose you could say that the sleep is implicitly postcoital, but that would be oddly coy, and from what I know of Pound, I suspect he has something else in mind, a misogyny that may still deserve that label, but is less dire than that in the original. Sleep and death are a woman's excellent seasons, because that's when, for a change, she's not talking. The most interesting of the English translations is an even better example of a poem mutating in its afterlife precisely through the loyalty of its fans. The 17th century poet and playwright William Cartwright is so absorbed by the challenge represented by Palladas' poem that he translates it 3 times, with 3 different ideas on how to match thalamos thanatos, and entitles the collective result Women, one poem just called Women. Give me a girl, if one I needs must meet, or in her nuptial or her winding sheet. I know but 2 good hours that women have, one in the bed, another in the grave. Thus of the whole sex, all I would desire is to enjoy their ashes or their fire. Something shifts as he repeats himself. The opening is sour enough, if one I needs must meet, as if not very welcome friends are determined to set him up with a new partner. But when he gets to the third and cleverest of his conceits, to enjoy their ashes or their fire, he reverses the pattern he's been following and gives the good hours out of natural order. First ashes, then fire. That may be no more than the exigency of rhyme, needs a rhyme with desire, but in poetry such exigencies can have a wisdom of their own, and the effect is to end the poem with a lilt, where you would expect, as it were, a coleam, and a sudden promise of new warmth. And part of the anticipation is that it's their fire. He doesn't imagine them just as passive instruments of his own pleasure. It is as though in rehearsing the mantra of his grumpiness, he talks himself out of it. By the last line, he finds himself using the word enjoy. And the references to death and ashes become part of what is now, at the end, a Carpe Diem poem. Temporarily thrown off stride, he's now started looking forward to his next rodeo. My real interest here, however, is not in Palladas' afterlife, which has its own paths to follow, but in what his most famous poem has to do with the rest of his work. To state the obvious, owing your literary immortality to one of the minor classics of Western misogyny is not a happy fate. But nothing about Palladas screams happy. The misogyny of 11,381 is not, as I've already indicated, an isolated thing. His 13 poems, specifically on the subject of women, are distributed across books 9, 10, and 11 of the anthology, but if assembled in a group, make a toxic nexus of almost unrelieved hostility to the opposite gender. In a recent study of them, William Henderson stresses their dissonance both with the much more varied attitudes displayed in the rest of the anthology and with evidence of changing attitudes towards women in Alexandria since Hellenistic times. It's actually a relief and something of a surprise when in a Carpe Diem poem, someone ambiguously ascribed to Palladas, this is 572, Gunaikes, women, are without further comment included along with wine, dancing, and flowery wreaths in a catalog of the trophées, the pleasures of life to be enjoyed before we die. It used to be possible, if you really wanted to do so, to ameliorate Palladas's misogyny by citing his epigram in praise of the brilliant pagan philosopher Hypatia, butchered by a Christian mob in 415 AD. That's 900. But compelling arguments from C.M. Bauer and more recently and drastically from Wilkinson make it chronologically impossible for Palladas to be the author. And in any case, scholars such as Luke and Alan Cameron have argued that the Hypatia of the poem was not the philosopher. She may have been a Christian nun. Passing references aside, Palladas saw no reason to write about women unless they could be the occasion for display of his choleric wit. 3 of Palladas's poems in the anthology and another one in the 10th century Syllogae Euphemiana are directed specifically against his wife. The only evidence that we have about Palladas's biography is what we find in the poems, and I should say that I don't have any confidence that he was, in fact, married, any more than I trust a 20th century comic telling take my wife jokes to be giving accurate biographical information. But the ranting about marriage does acquire a new dimension when it intersects another favorite topic of Palladas, one where it's hard to imagine his making up his personal investment for the sake of comic effect. Here is 9-168, number 10. Unhappy man, I have taken destructive anger to be my wife, and my profession starts with anger. Oh, I'm a man of much anger through a double necessity, the craft of literary scholarship and a warrior wife. 1181 begins Pasogene holos estin. Here, a particular woman is characterized in the same way, but using a word with rather more punch to it, both in its lexical meaning and its literary pedigree. The anger is not just domestic abrasion, but the murderous anger of Achilles in the Iliad. Menen ulomenen. Destructive anger. That combines the incipits of the first 2 lines of the Iliad, if you will, the first 2 lines of European literature, which are also, of course, the first lines of Greek literature, both chronologically and in the curriculum that Palladas tells us in several points provided his livelihood as a grammatikos, a teacher of language and literature. That livelihood has proved as infuriating as his marriage. Together they have made him, in an allusion to the second work on the syllabus, together they've made him in an allusion to the second work on the syllabus, polumenis, a man of much anger, by a change of one letter from polumetis, a famous epithet for the hero of the Odyssey. The way I feel about my wife is the way I feel about my job. The poem in the Syllogae covers much the same ground, and this is number 11. This is not an anthology. It's been found in another source. Studying Sing the Anger and teaching Sing the Destructive Anger, and again, Menen aede and Menen ulomenen. I have studying Sing the Anger and teaching Sing the Destructive Anger. I have, unhappy man, taken a wife. All day she battles, and all night she makes war, as if taking combat as a dowry from her mother. If I want to be silent and retire from the battle, she fights about the fact that I'm not fighting. The Epigrammata Bobiensia, a collection of poems apparently from 4th or early 5th century Gaul, where Palladas's poems were known and imitated, has a Latin reimagining of this poem using the tag arma virumque. In the anthology, a trail of epigrams following 9-168 keeps harping on the opening of the Iliad. In 173, the reference is extended to the first 5 lines, and then, quote, this is number 12. The starting point of literary study, arche grammatikes, the starting point of literary study is a 5-verse curse. Line 1 has anger. Line 2, destructive. And again, after destructive, numberless sorrows for the Greeks. Line 3 leads souls down to Hades. And in line 4, food for swift dogs, birds of prey. In line 5, the anger of Zeus. So how, after 5 curses and 5 petoses, can a teacher of literature not suffer terrible misery? Petoses is an untranslatable pun. It means both a fall or calamity and a grammatical inflection, the sort of thing a grammaticus spends his life dealing with. His wretched life, a life of curses and cases. It's a life as wretched as the life of an Achaean warrior when Zeus is working for the other side. The seed of the conceit may have been sown by Lucilius. An entry ascribed to him in the Anthology weaves the grammaticos, a garland of words for anger. This is Lucilius here, it's 279. This is number 13 on the handout. No grammaticos can ever be, and probably olbios, or happy. It's clearly somewhere that means happy. It's just missing in the manuscript. No grammaticos can ever be happy. From the start, they're all orge and manis and holos. This already sounds so much like Palladas that several scholars have switched the attribution. Palladas sets out the financial specifics of the profession's wretchedness in 9:174, for which Harrison's translation does nicely. And this is Harrison again. This is number 14 in the Greek. It's grammarians that the gods torment, and Homer's fatal wrath their instrument. Monthly, if that, the grudging nanny wraps their measly pittance in papyrus scraps. She nicks some, switches coins, and not content, holds out her grasping claws for 10%, then lays at teacher's feet a screw of stuff like paper poppies on a cenotaph. Just get one loving father to agree to pay in decent gold a yearly fee. The 11th month, just when it's almost due, he'll hire a better teacher and fire you. Your food and lodging gone, he's got the gall to crack after dinner jokes about it all. And lest we forget, he reminds us in 169, it all goes back to women. Number 15, the anger of Achilles was the cause of poverty to me when I became a grammaticos. I wish that that anger had killed me along with the Greeks before the bitter hunger of grammatikae had ruined me. But in order for Agamemnon to steal Briseis and Paris Helen, I have become poor. Woman, we are told in 165, the poem that initiates this run of epigrams is the anger of Zeus. The noun in this case is orge, and Homer knew this. And in 166, this is number 16, Homer shows that woman is evil and treacherous, chaste or whorish, in either case ruinous. Slaughter of men came from Helen's adultery and death from Penelope's chastity. The sufferings in the Iliad are because of one woman, and Penelope is the cause of the Odyssey, unquote. Making Penelope a malign angel of death has some authorization in Homer's text, though it's the ghost of one of the newly slain suitors who sees her that way, contriving death for us and a black fate in Book 24 as they're down there in Hades and attributing Penelope the key role in their death. Adopting his perspective, which is basically what Palladas does in his poem, adopting his perspective serves the poet's term in articulating a vision of being beset by a world of implacable wrath jointly mandated by the founding text of his profession and by the nature of women, which is to bestow a kind of mythic justification upon the aesthetic of the Scopic epigram. It is Homeric warfare conducted by other means amid the crowded downscale indignities of urban life in the late Empire. Palladas is at perhaps his most forthcoming in 1049, and this is number 17. They say even ants and gnats have bile, chole. So while the puniest animals have bile, do you urge me to expose myself to everyone without any bile, not to fight back even with bare words against those who have done me wrong with their actions? I'll have to stop my mouth with a reed and not breathe, unquote. He intends, of course, to do no such thing, unless perhaps you take him to be implying that what he won't say, he will write. In this poem, the sense of being assaulted by the cholos, anger of others, or the gall here of others, is preemptively balanced by the retaliatory chole already in him by instinct. Birds do it, bees do it, even fleas with PhDs do it. Though Cole Porter was writing about sex and Palladas is writing about sarcasm. It is his nature and his gift. I wouldn't sell that satisfaction short. It's a satisfaction that anyone who makes a living studying and teaching great literature will recognize. But there is an undercurrent that gives Palladas' case another dimension. The record, which may well be incomplete, suggests that practicing the craft of the abusive epigram in choice classical Greek was not just a heroic but also a lonely effort in his day and time. We don't really know of any contemporary practitioners, and without those, there would not be a contest worth winning. Homeric heroism is all about outdoing competition. Even if we're wrong about that, there's an encroaching darkness just beyond the annoyance. Its most tangible manifestation is structured almost like a joke. Not only is grammatike a wretched, unrewarding line of work, barumochthos, he calls it in 1097, hard labor, but to make it worse, we hear in 9:175, this is number 18, he just got fired. I'm selling my Calemachus and Pindar and the other grammatical cases since I've got the case of poverty. That's ptoses again, another pun on ptoses again. For Dorotheus has cut off the salary, and the Greek word there is syntaxin, another one of these puns, that supported me. If 1097 is about the same professional setback, it happened at the immensely inconvenient age of 72. But he can also summon up a declaration of good riddance, as in 11:378, one of the poems where he groups his job and his marriage. And this is number 19, quoting the Greeks there, number 19. I cannot put up with a wife and with grammatike, impoverishment from grammatike and injustice from a wife. From both I suffer death and fate. But just now I have, with difficulty, escaped from grammatike. But I cannot escape a man-fighting wife. A contract and an Ausonian, i.e. Roman, law forbid it, unquote. There's a characteristic Homeric allusion behind the word I just translated as man-fighting. Palladas makes a joke, he also makes in 571, by using the etymological sense of the most distinguished wifely name in the Iliad, Andromache, Andromache. It's still the Trojan War back at home, but at least I've been able to get out of that other house of wrath I've been living in. Wilkinson employs this poem in his arguments for moving Palladas' dates earlier even than C. M. Bowra suggested. It would indeed be in the spirit of the genre for this poem to be, among other things, a current events joke prompted by Constantine's alteration of Roman divorce law in 331 to make unilateral divorce by either sex all but impossible. The new law was unpopular, and the status quo ante was effectively restored by the end of the reign of Julian in 363, though I agree with Wilkinson that if this is what the poem is referring to, it would make sense to date it and Palladas, and hence, if this is indeed something that really happened, Palladas' exit from the business of grammatike to 331, or soon thereafter, when it was fresh news and hence good material for his brand of stand-up. Whatever the date, the poem voices fervent relief at his retirement, involuntary or otherwise, from the literature biz. In 9:171, he is positively eager about getting out, happy at the prospect of a new techne that he doesn't specify, though it evidently doesn't involve books, or for that matter, language. And this is number 20. I'm selling the tools of the muses, those books that make you groan, as I turn to the tasks of a different profession, just techne, we don't know what it is. Farewell, Pierides. I say goodbye, syntaxomai, syntaxis again. I say goodbye to you, words, for syntax is the death of me. In 9:175, he is selling his books because he needs the money. Here, that may be part of it, but the main thing is he's glad to get rid of them. In my ear, this rhymes with the rejection of Platonic idealism in 1045, the first poem that I dealt with, a struggling free of that grim, heavy, wordy tradition to which he has for some reason devoted his life and which traces its lineage back to that angry, murderous poem of war, Goodbye to All That. An old man's poem, but also one in which we intuit that Palladas's implicit subject, here and elsewhere, is classical culture itself, the subject of his pedagogy. In his lifetime, that culture came to face with the prospect of its own mortality, refracted in a number of poems about the rise of Christianity. The word Christiano actually appears in one of his poems, 9:528. Statues of pagan gods melted down for coinage or repurposed for churches, malign Christian influences on an unfaithful wife who's switching her allegiance from the 12 Olympians to the 12 apostles, 1052, and most dramatically, the dire condition of the Hellenes, as he refers to them. And this is one of them, this is 1082, it's number 21 in the Greek. Are we actually dead and only seen to be alive, we Hellenes, fallen into misfortune and imagining that a dream is real life? Or are we alive and is life itself dead? And then number 22 is 1090. We Hellenes are men turned to ashes, holding on to the buried hopes of the dead, for everything now has been turned topsy-turvy. Neither of these poems actually mention Christianity, but I'm not aware of anyone who doesn't take them to concern the crisis of cultural identity that the Christianization of the empire induced in the literate elite, and even in his professed poverty, Palladas would have been of that elite, invested in the old order. The traditional dating relates the poem containing those last lines to the events of 391, when a Theodosian edict effectively forbade the practice of the old religion and several pagan temples were looted by Christians. Wilkinson proposes instead that they are prompted by the victory of the now unmistakably Christian Emperor Constantine over his rival Licinius in 324, arguably an even more meaningful turning point in cultural history. This encounter is registered in Palladas's poetry only in a spotty way and is often cryptic in its details, but one thing it does not include is anything resembling a defense of the pagan culture whose obsolescence seems to be on offer. Saying we are alive and life itself is dead really doesn't count. And I don't think we would expect it of him. The absence of such a defense has in the past been cited in ill-advised arguments that Palladas actively converted to Christianity. But that seems to me a blinkered deduction. It misses the special quality and extremity of Palladas's despair, the despair of someone who, as Luke puts it, quote, has clearly reached a point where he considers hopelessness as a positive achievement, unquote. What we might expect from Palladas as a summary statement, is perhaps indicated for us by the Yale Epigram Codex, which frustratingly does not contain a satisfactory text of any single poem, but does allow us to match its fragments to some extant poems in the anthology, including two not attributed there to Palladas. If the Codex is indeed, as Wilkinson and his team have cogently argued, a collection of poems by Palladas, then we now have reason to make additions to his oeuvre, including one epigram with, I think, powerful resonance within the context I've been setting out here. And this is 127. This is number 23, the last of them. If a little sweet wine is left in the bowl, that remnant turns bitter. In the same way, when an old man, having drawn off the whole of life, passes into the depths of old age, he becomes bitterly angry. Oxylokos. Friedrich Jacobs, who produced the first critical edition of the Palatine Anthology in the early 19th century, did guess this might be by Palladas. The sentiment itself isn't new with him. It can be found in a fragment attributed to Antiphanes, a comic playwright from the age of Aristophanes. Though as a standalone epigram in 4th century Alexandria, it has new plangency. The change of something of intoxicating sweetness into something harsh and sour as it comes to the end of its run doesn't really require an explanation. It's no more than the working out of a chemical reaction, a law of nature, what happens with the last of the wine.